Hi everyone, this is Karen Kowal from All Chicago, and I'm going to get this webinar started. So, sorry, having a little technical problem already. So I'm here with Jennifer Fabrini and Elizabeth Perez, our senior program managers from All Chicago. And we also have two very special guests who are going to assist us with questions today, Aaron Waiver and Taylor Keeley, I never know how to say your name, from the local HUD offices here to help us answer any questions that we may not be able to answer as the All Chicago staff. So we're very excited and grateful to have them on. So for the webinar today, we do have everyone muted, and that if you're on the phone and you need to mute your line, it's *6. If you're having trouble with the audio, sometimes it is better just to dial in. We do extensively utilize the chat box or the question box for any questions you may have, and so Jennifer, Elizabeth, and I will take turns manning the chat box when the others are not speaking. So if you have a question at any time, please feel free to use the question box to put your questions in there. So we're happy you could take some time out of your day today. I know everyone's really busy with everything that's going on to be with us to talk about these three topics. So we're going to overview a new policy that the CoC board adopted and the process we're going to be implementing to expedite housing in the system. You're kind of the first to hear about this. We're in the process of releasing a brief, so you'll get a little preview of that information here today. HUD released last week, I think it was only last week, the days really are flowing together, late last week, about an expedited grant amendment process. So we're going to review that and address any questions. It's a great opportunity for people to ensure they're spending down and utilizing their grants to the fullest under the COVID-19 health crisis. And then we just wanted to have some space again for the HUD waivers to make sure that people understood the process of applying and how to implement them. But really, HUD's been refining their guidance on how to make sure you're documenting things and keeping track of things effectively if you're implementing any of these waivers. And so we wanted to just share a little bit of information on that and leave a good chunk of time for questions. So I'm going to start with the CoC policy and the expedited housing initiative. So I think, you know, during any health crisis, we're really seeing and feeling the need for housing, right? Many of you on this call are probably also involved in the shelter system and working on decompressing shelters. Some of you operate projects that are more congregate in nature. And so we're all trying to do our best part to social distancing and keeping people healthy. And we know as housing providers and as the homeless system that the best way to assist people with that is by providing them with a home, right? So this policy, we're calling it an expedited housing initiative. And at the April board meeting, which was really just on April 15th, the board endorsed a series of policies for our system that will influence the way we quickly move people into permanent housing. So the adjustments we're looking to make will expedite housing placements and ensure that the system remains nimble during this crisis. And really, this is a moment in time where we get to show everyone that the system is nimble. So we have constructed a nimble system. It feels slow a lot of the time, but it's a point to pivot, and we want to make sure we still remain nimble during this part. And All Chicago is really working hard to help facilitate this change among many of the other ones that we've been working with you on over the past almost a month now. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of the system adjustments that we're seeing as a result of this policy. So really, the All Chicago, the Center for Housing and Health, and the corporate and CSH are working together to coordinate the effort and utilize the action agenda structure. We're working really closely with DFSS, of course, our primary partner, but also CDPH working on these adjustments. So some of the things we're working on is the coordinated entry prioritization. So, you know, the coordinated entry system is and needs to be nimble in order to pivot when we need to make changes, right? We often don't make changes in Chicago because we just have so many people with such high needs, but this is a moment in time where we see that the needs of some are changing because of COVID-19, and we want to expedite the matching process. We're really taking the work that we've been doing as with the rapid rehousing program for system-wide landlord engagement, and then the system landlord engagement work group, or SLU, and just really bringing that across the system and then do system-wide landlord engagement. So there's going to be a lot of work with landlords and making sure there's units and not having as much need for providers to look for units, and we can just call upon a bank of units. Increasing the uses and flexibility of bridge and rapid rehousing. So, I mean, this is critical because we don't want folks moving out of like a quarantine or isolation situation and going back into the general homeless population or shelter. And so we see bridge and rapid rehousing as the most nimble way to do that and flexible way to do that, and put somebody in a home quickly and then figuring out what their permanent solution might be. And then we're, doing a lot of effort to reduce barriers to housing, identification, documentation, working with the higher level parts of the system in order to do that. And then provider adjustments. So this is the housing provider adjustments. So we have been providing you all with technical assistance. We'll continue to do that. And one of the asks from the board was to have some accountability during this time. And so we're looking to you to do a few things that we've already talked about, is utilizing any waivers or other means to bypass regulatory requirements. You can house people more quickly. We've been talking about the variety of HUD waivers. And if you have any other non-regulatory requirements to access housing, that you waive those as well, right? Like there's nothing from the CoC perspective that requires an income, even though some other, or requires an ID even. So getting to the lowest point of barriers that we can and are able to do. And then identify ways that you can connect yourself better to the system-wide effort that we're putting forward. So some of the next steps that we're looking at is we are working on this accountability plan, and we'll be, some of you who are on the System Performance and Evaluation Committee will be getting an email from me today about a time to chat through and talk through this accountability plan and get your feedback on it. So again, working with you to identify amendments to our current processes. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading my screen. For the coordinated entry process and vulnerability. So we're working with a lot of partners to make sure we're prioritizing the right people. We're working again with across the city to centralize landlord engagement. Some of you on the phone, or some of your coworkers, were probably on a call last week about housing location and how y'all can help us have a centralized list of landlords to utilize. And then identify other regulatory barriers and asking those funders to create waivers or give clear guidance of what providers should be doing to overcome those barriers during this health crisis. Like, we know that some of you are experiencing barriers through the CHA or IDA or through the trust fund, and we're working on our end to proactively and aggressively talk to them about reducing and trying to eliminate some of those barriers so we can get people housed. What we're looking at for the next steps from providers. So we've talked about this for a few weeks now, but if you haven't already, this really emergency record keeping protocols should be one of your new best friends, and making sure you have those record keeping protocols in place, applying for any of the HUD waivers that you may need. And then, if you have staff capacity, or, seeing that how you were doing business before is very different because you're doing it at home, and so that may mean shifting that, your intensive caseload of 15 might be more manageable if you don't have to go out and see people, so you could see more people. Like, we are looking for ways to redirect that capacity in different ways. And one of those is the landlord engagement part, but another way, maybe we need more services too. And then, you know, again, looking internally to see how you can expedite or change your process to make things faster. Hopefully you all have already done that. Again, involvement in committees and work groups through the action agenda is always a great way. And then when we have that accountability plan to review that, and I'm sure we'll provide some other technical assistance for that. And then I'm just going to pause in case there were any questions. I didn't see any while we were talking, but I just wanted to check one more time. And I don't see any. There is one, but I think it's not really, it was already answered. All right, so I'm going to move it. I'm going to hand off it over to Elizabeth and see, I have her talk about grant amendments.
Hey, thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. So for this portion, I'm going to be talking about the CoC program expedited COVID-19 grant agreement amendment. So these amendments are applicable to those who have a HUD CoC grant, and it's currently the FY 2018 executed grant. So we saw on Friday, on April 17th, HUD released guidance in this amendment process, and it really gives the ability to amend existing grants to provide housing, services, and other necessities to support eligible clients. One thing to note as you are looking as to whether you would pursue this is that you have to make sure that you are including documentation in your project files that support the request for the grant amendment. So this is a new process that we haven't seen before. So a couple of things to keep note of is that it does allow the ability for you to do three things. You can temporarily change budget line items. So in the example, if you do not have an eligible budget line item, such as supportive service, you do have the ability to move some of your allocation to this budget line item. So you can be shifting between rental assistance and supportive assistance. So this is going to be a temporary only for the duration of your contract, and it is only for your FY 2018 executed grant. For those of you that have already started to operate your FY 2019 grants, HUD will be releasing some guidance soon regarding whether this expedited process will be seen for those grants as well. But for the time being, we'll only be focusing on the FY 2018. So because it allows for you to do some additional eligible activities and shift funds, one thing to keep in mind is that you cannot ask for more funding than what has already been allocated to your program. So it's really just a shift in budget line items. The third thing that you can do under this process is you can extend the operating year. So if your grant was scheduled to end at the end of June, but you wanted to make sure that you spent down all your money and did a few shifting between budget line items, and you wish to extend your budget line until December 31st of 2020, that is going to be a permanent change. So it's going to affect your operating start and end dates moving forward. So just keep that in mind. That is the only thing that is not temporary. And the last possible day that you can extend it till is until December 31st of 2020. Next slide. Great. So HUD created a process. It's a pretty easy process from what we can tell. So you can easily access the grant agreements on their HUD website. The downfall of doing that is that it does show you all the recipients of Illinois or everyone from our continuum of care. So what we have gone ahead and done is put them in a Google Drive and sorted them out based on agency. So you want to make sure that you are selecting your agency appropriate because that it coincides with your grant numbers and so forth. The next one is you're going to view the grant amendment request form, and there's a lot of highlighted items, so you're just going to want to make sure that you are only providing information for the activity that you wish to pursue. You will have to sign the grant amendment request form, so we'll go a little bit more in detail as to the two ways that you can do so. And then finally, you have to email it to the field office inbox, and also make sure that you do CC your CDPD representative. All right, next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, you'll click on the link and you'll be able to see all of the different agencies that receive a HUD CoC grant. So just make sure that you navigate to your agency specific. And if you have multiple grants, make sure that you're viewing it based on the grant number and so forth, because you want to make sure that you're selecting the correct grant. All right, next slide, please. So on the screen, you'll see that the forms will be pre-populated. So you'll see that it has the grant number. You want to make sure that that is the correct grant number, that it has the correct tax ID number, your DUNS number, and that you have the recipient's name. Because we went ahead and just kind of divided it up based on agency, you still want to make sure that your name is listed as the recipient name. As you can see on the screen, there's a lot of like highlighted. That's a lot of instructional text for you to help assist you as to what you will be completed and which of the three options you have to pursue you will navigate. If it doesn't apply to you or you do not wish to do that, please make sure that you omit that, just because you want to make sure that it's as clear cut and that all that instructional text is removed from your grant agreement. All right. Then the third step is to sign the grant amendment request form. So the signature pages are seen on a separate page, which makes it a little bit easier for everyone to sign. So you can do it two ways. You want to make sure that the authorized official is the one signing and dating the document. So you can print the document, sign, and then scan with the signature and add it into the rest of the document. Or you can add an electronic signature to that document. Next slide. So once you have done that, you want to make sure that you complete the grant request. You send that to the appropriate bodies. So right there, you'll be able to send your request to CPD_COVID-19 amendment CHI@HUD.org. And again, please make sure that you do email your HUD rep and that they're included in there as well, just so that they are aware that this is going to happen. Make sure that you are including the signature page for that. Next page. And then what happens afterwards is HUD is going to review your grant amendment. Obviously, they're going to be checking for that the submission is complete, and they may reach out to you and ask you some clarifying questions regarding your submission. If all moves flawlessly and they have no concerns, they will be providing you with an executed grant amendment copy by email. So make sure that you are looking for that. And those are immediate changes that you can see. So once they issue that, they'll be doing the changes in the ELOC system, so you are able to make those drawdowns for your grant. All right, so I will pause and take a minute to take any questions.
So Liz, there are questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to read them or have us read them to you.
Thanks. If you guys want to read them, that's great.
So our first question is, I am concerned about the long-term effect both on the agency and the clients if we accept more clients than in our grant agreement. What happens when this is over?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll make sure, as we mentioned in the beginning, we have Taylor and Aaron joining us, so feel free to jump in. I think, one of the things and the purpose for allowing for this expedited process is really to be able to create some flexibility and allow providers that may be seeing that they can benefit from an extension or have some ability to shift funds to provide services because they're anticipating that by the end of their grant year, they may not be fully spent down. So instead of giving back that money, how do we, repurpose it to really support these COVID-19 crisis that we are currently experiencing?
I mean, I would say too, like if you're concerned about whether you can manage it over the long term, like we at All Chicago are happy to talk through that with you as well. I don't know if Aaron or Taylor, if you had anything else to add to that one. It's okay to not.
This is Aaron. I'll just say that we are aware of the concerns. We share those concerns, and we're trying to find a way forward. What I would say is that right now, given the urgency of the situation, we just, our primary concern is ensuring the health and safety of everyone. I would strongly encourage everyone to make sure that they are coordinating their efforts, not just with the CoC, but also with your local entitlement jurisdiction, because I think that whatever solution we end up with, it's going to require kind of a team approach, if you will, right? There's a number of different funding streams, not only within CARES, but also just in general that may be able to provide a more sustainable solution to some of these things. But right now, we don't have a lot that we can say on this other than we are aware of the issue, and we're trying to do what we can within the frameworks we've been provided.
Thanks, Aaron. We do have a question regarding environmental review. So for programs that utilize the master lease program, is HUD willing to waive the required environmental review to make it easier to engage new landlords faster?
The Office of Environment and Energy did release some additional guidance on environmental reviews. I believe it was on April 6th. I'll toss that link in the chat box so you all can see it. But as of right now, I am not aware of any new waivers that are specific to environmental on that issue. I know that at the SNAP's office, we're taking all the questions and concerns that we've heard through the office hours that are every Friday, which I would highly encourage folks to attend. That we're taking that information and we're basing our next steps in part on that. So there may be the possibility of future waivers, but we don't know right now. Obviously, there's a lot of different steps for the development of waivers. I would encourage you to work with your local CPD representative, and if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to me specifically. I'll put my email address in the chat box as well, so you all can see it.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So I think there's a couple of helpful, I believe someone shared a kind of a solution on the question that we started off with, what can we do with the clients that we have agreed to take on once this is over. So one provider shared that when they have overleased grants, they have not just replaced people as individuals were transitioning out, so kind of helping thinking on a longer term once some individuals transition out, not replacing them, so you can kind of go back to your regular amount. So thank you for sharing that. That could be something that we can think about and share if other providers are looking as to how they've done similar situations, but maybe on a smaller scale. That'd be great to think through. We have a question about how long do we believe the process will take to occur after submission. I believe that the process will happen rather quickly, but Taylor or Erin, if you have any insight, if there's any suggested timeline as far as like how long we should expect.
Yeah, this is Taylor. Amendment for the amendments?
Yes.
Yeah, for me, I've processed 2, and it took a day. So I would highly recommend making sure you copy your CPD rep.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful to know. So when you guys said expedited, you really meant expedited.
Yeah, we, part of the reason that we set up the amendments on HUD Exchange is to cut down on the back and forth between grantees and our office. So, right, the first time that the HUD office receives the agreement, it's already been signed on your end. So literally the steps on our side are review and either reject or approve. So it reduced, I think, a 20-step process to a 5-step process in total. So we really tried to kind of completely re-engineer it for that purpose to expedite it. So I think, Taylor's right, processing wise doesn't take a lot of time. Just please be aware that, there are a lot of these that are coming in. There are a lot of other issues that your rep might have. So I just want to make sure that, our target goal is for processing within 5 days of receipt. Hopefully it'll be faster than that, but please be understanding that there may be other things pressing, especially with CoC renewals right now. We're trying to process a lot of stuff at once. So just we ask for your patience with that, and we promise to provide it in return.
Great, thanks, Erin. So I know we have some questions about FMR, so I think we're going to be talking about that next. So we're going to hold that for Jennifer, who's going to be talking about the waivers. And I know, Erin, you mentioned that you're open to talk about the environmental review, and you've included your email address to just chat a little bit more one-on-one. And we had a question about the end date. So I know historically we've seen that HUD typically doesn't allow for grants to operate on a calendar base, but just to kind of reiterate, for these grant amendments, HUD is looking that they would extend the grant until December 31st, 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, it's the operating. You may go through the end of this year. That is correct, and they are only temporary changes. They won't carry forward. Well, sorry, the change in, you're correct. The change in your operating start date will carry forward. That's the only change that will happen afterwards.
Great, thank you. So since the other ones are related to the HUD waivers, I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer. And if you're still kind of thinking about a question for the grant amendment process, feel free to type them into the chat box and we can answer them as we go. And also, if we have some time at the end, maybe we can ask some for our HUD reps if time allows.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Fabrini. I'm a program manager with All Chicago. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I'll be talking about the HUD waivers. I'll be giving some new, well, not new information, but some additional information. We're going to be specifically talking about documentation of using the HUD waivers. And we'll also leave some time for questions and answers to allow you to ask questions about how you are implementing the HUD waiver. So, and in addition to those two things, we're also going to just recap some information about emergency record keeping policies. All Chicago has provided some guidance on this, and so it's an important thing to consider during this crisis. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Next slide, please. So last week on Tuesday, April 14th, HUD had a webinar about the mega waiver. And one great piece of information that we learned from that webinar was the guidance to consider two types of documentation when you're using the waivers. So you want to consider your recipient level documentation as well as your client level documentation. So with your recipient or agency level of documentation, everybody should be keeping on file a copy of the waiver notification letter that you send to HUD. So if you've done this already, hopefully you have, and that's the letter where you indicated which of the waivable items you were planning to use and the date that you would start doing so. So you want to keep that on file. You also want to keep on file your emergency record keeping policies and procedures. So that should go hand in hand. You know, the reason that it's important to have emergency record keeping is that, you know, you should have an overall emergency policy and procedures, and within that, something that outlines what you do about record keeping during your emergency. So I'll get into that a little bit more on 2 more slides ahead, but that's part of your recipient level documentation. And then regarding like the specific waivers that you're using, you want to keep some additional documentation of the constraints or barriers or limitations that your program is experiencing that make it necessary to use the waivers and the emergency record keeping protocol. So I have some examples here. So if you're thinking about the fact that you can't do physical housing inspections right now, you're making use of a waiver that allows you to do those virtually through photos or videos or other means. Then, for example, one thing you would consider documenting in your file is the shelter-in-place order, because that's the reason that you're not going out to do those housing inspections. So we have, for example, something you could keep is a copy of the governor's order, and I'll put that link in the chat in a few minutes. There's other things you could document as well. That's a suggestion. Another example is if you're not able to obtain disability documentation right now, so you're making use of the waiver that allows you to have clients self-certify, excuse me, their disability, then you may want to document, you know, office closures that made it difficult for you to obtain disability documentation. So you could go online and pull off of websites, you know, notices that offices are not open at this time. And then a third example here is if you're not able to do case management on a monthly basis for a rapid rehousing program due to limited staff capacity, then you would want to document, you know, what was happening in your agency with the limited staff capacity as, you know, supporting documentation of why you use that particular waiver. So those are just some examples, but your agency should think through for your particular situation, what you're seeing, what constraints and barriers you're seeing, and document that at the agency level and have that on file as support. I always like to think about the advice that if you don't document it, then it didn't happen, right? So just want to think about putting as much down in documentation as possible. I'll go to the next slide, please. So client level documentation. So in addition to your recipient level documentation, whenever you're using a specific waiver for a specific client, you want to make a note into the file of the client outlining that you are applying that waiver and including a date so that it can be clear that this fell within the time frame given for the waivers. So I just drafted here a couple sentences as an example of a note that you might make in a file, and you're welcome to adapt this. You probably would want to add more detail onto this depending on the exact waiver that you're using for the client. But this just shows that, you know, let's say, for example, that you're housing a client on April 21st, which is, you know, after the waiver went into effect. And so let's say you're housing them and you're making use of the waiver that allows you to go above FMR for leasing projects. Then you could indicate, you know, in the file that so-and-so was housed on April 21st during the pandemic. The FMR waiver applies. And then you would definitely want to make note that there's additional information in your recipient level documentation that demonstrates you notified HUD you're using that waiver and that you have an emergency record keeping policy. So you wouldn't need to necessarily have a copy of your waiver notification and emergency policy in every client file, but you would want to have notes referring back to those things. And then additionally, you should have other details or documents specifically related to the waivers that you're using for that client. So for example, if you are, you know, going to pay above FMR for a lease, then a copy of the lease that clearly displays the date of execution, which would clearly show that it's within the waiver time frame. So just for example, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, HUD had a webinar last week where they talked about recipient level documentation and client level documentation. And so we do have a link to their slides and their recorded webinar, but I did pull out, just as an example, one of the charts that they shared. And so they outlined for the FMR, you know, being able to go above FMR for leasing individual units. They said that the suggested recipient documentation would be documentation that FMR limits are impeding your ability to find units for clients, as well as your waiver notification that you sent to HUD, as well as your emergency record keeping policies and procedures. And then on the client level documentation side, for this specific waiver, they would recommend that you have a copy of the lease, a note to file about the memorandum, and then a completed rent reasonableness analysis, because you still need to do rent reasonableness even though you can waive FMR. We do recommend that you have an emergency record keeping protocol. All Chicago released some guidance on this. We have a long document that kind of outlines for you the steps you can take to develop a emergency record keeping policy. And we also provided an example of a protocol and a template. But basically, you want to have a protocol that outlines how you're going to do certain things, and then also a template that is more like a form where you're going to actually document the specifics of this particular emergency. So your protocol would outline how you would determine the start of the emergency. So for example, which officer within your agency will be responsible for declaring, you know, that you're going into your emergency protocols. As well as determining the start of the emergency, you want to describe the types of records that are impacted by the emergency. So, you know, are your homeless documentation records impacted? Are your income documents impacted? Are your leases impacted? Housing quality inspections. So you want to list out what all of those things are that are being impacted, and then also describe the efforts that the agency will use to maintain those records during this time. So you can describe, that you're continuing to make attempts to acquire documentation, how you're adjusting your procedures, either by using a waiver, or if there's not a waiver for a specific thing that you have a barrier to, what process are you taking to make adjustments, and then also outlining which of these things you'll go back to and try and acquire additional documentation at a later date. So you want to basically lay out everything that you're doing differently at this time. And then the protocol should also have a procedure for declaring that the emergency is over.
Jennifer, and if you can remind us where individuals can find the protocols?
So this slide we have up now is where I have the links, and I know you can't click on the screen, but as soon as I finish talking, I will pop those into the chat for everyone. But it is on the All Chicago website. So at this point in time, we'll see what questions do you all have about implementing the HUD waivers, and I'm sure myself and Karen and Elizabeth, as well as our colleagues from HUD, Taylor and Aaron, can all try and chime in to help answer these questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a question. If a waiver is put into effect that allows for a unit at a higher than FMR rent, must the rent be reduced to FMR once the emergency has ended?
So this is Aaron. The way it's going to work is it's for any lease that was executed from March 31st on. So it will, the FMR provision stands for the entirety of that lease, right? It's going to be essentially 1 year for that lease that unit can be above FMR. Now, when it comes to what happens at the end of that lease period, that kind of falls in that category of what I told you all before, that we are aware that it is going to be an issue, and we're trying to figure out what we can do. But as of right now, we have no official guidance on that. Just know that it does cover the entirety of that 1 year lease.
Great, thanks. And someone asked if they requested a waiver and ended up not using it for whatever reason. Is that okay, or is there going to be, something that they have to do on their end to report back out?
So I want to reiterate something. I think there's been a lot of confusion from folks. You're not requesting the use of the waiver. You're just notifying HUD, and then you can utilize the waiver. You don't have to wait on anything from us. You don't have to wait for approval or anything like that. It's you submit a notification to us via the email that was provided in the chat box. You wait 2 days, and then you can utilize the waiver. In terms of whether you use the waiver or not, right, the availability section of the memorandum that was issued on March 31st essentially states that you are to estimate when you plan on using it. If you don't use it, that's fine. But if you do, you have to document the specific justification for the use of it. And that's at the program level. That's why you've heard a lot about emergency record keeping policies and protocols. That's going to serve as part of your justification, right? In there, you're going to have a program file that says, here's the waivers we requested, and here's why we think we're going to need them. And please, please, please provide more detail than because we were addressing COVID-19. It needs to be specific to the waiver, and I would encourage you to use the memo as your guide. It breaks down why each waiver was provided. It essentially provides a justification as to why HUD is granting the waiver. You should use that as your guide for documenting what your internal justification is going to be, so that way, right, anyone who dealt with emergency funds before, especially on the DR side or CDBGR, you know that the IG likes to come back and check on where all this money went. that's the person you really have to worry about, right? I mean, you need to be aware of us coming out and monitoring your local HUD reps, and we're going to want to see that justification. But right, we tell you every time we monitor, the IG plays for keeps. We're the nice guys. They're not the nice guys.
I mean, I also wanted to reiterate, because someone put a question in the chat, like, you don't do separate waivers or notifications for each participant, right? You're just doing one for the agency, and then you can use that, implement that waiver as many times as you need to for as many participants as you do. So like, once you notify about the waiver, like, then you just apply it for whoever needs it as many times as you need to.
Exactly. The only exceptions to that would be the consolidated plan waiver, which I think is number 8 or 9. And on that one, you have to submit a separate notification each time that you submit a substantial amendment to the plan. But that's, that doesn't necessarily apply to your CoC grantees. So just for the client, one waiver notification for your planned use of the waiver for the first time you plan to use it, and then thereafter you continue to utilize it.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So we did have a question whether CHA will honor the waivers of missing documents. So that's a complicated question, as all of you know. So that there was from HUD, they did release waivers for public housing authorities, and some of those are about documentation like income. Our understanding is that CHA is planning to apply for those waivers. How they communicate that to you all, I'm not real sure. But on the other side, not the other side, but All Chicago is advocating. We're sending a memo requesting that CHA, IDA, and the trust fund relax or give guidance on emergency record keeping policies during this time. And then we are going to follow up with some calls to people to ensure that happens. So that's the best that we're doing on our side of that. It is complicated, and we don't have authority over CHA for them to do that, but we hope they will, in the vein of like doing the right thing and helping people during this health crisis. We still have plenty of time for more questions if people have them. And it can be questions on any of the topics we talked about. If you want to ask about grant amendments, if you want to ask about waivers, I think we've covered everything that we've already gotten in the question box. I mean, Liz, I know you asked this, but since Aaron and Taylor are on the line, someone asked about whether the CoC amendments can cover IT costs. They say some of the case managers are using home computers that aren't set up for the agency server. This is hindering service delivery of case management. Could someone put in an amendment to have money for IT, or I would file some of this maybe under HMIS data entry? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so what we're saying regarding this, right, we want to provide the flexibility we can to you. So make sure that there's the 3-part test in 2 CFR 200, necessary, reasonable, and allocable. That those you follow that process outlined in 2 CFR 200. And yeah, if you need to provide case management remotely, if you're using your personal phone for that and you're going to have to incur costs that way, or you're I know, right, FaceTime in order to do the HQS inspections for an initial unit move-in. Those things, as long as they meet the requirements at 2 CFR 200, should be eligible for, as long as you have your line items that will allow for that, so on and so forth. But If you have any questions that are, let's say you're really not sure if it meets the 3-part test, then I highly recommend you reach out to your CPD rep. But do us all a favor, right? Start by going through to CFR 200 and that section that breaks down how you determine whether a cost is eligible. Go through that process, and when you send that email then to your rep, you're going to say, hey, here's the cost that we're incurring, here's why we're incurring it, I believe it is eligible based on X, Y, and Z, and you're literally outlining why you think it's eligible. Then you're going to get a much faster response from us, because it's going to be it's going to be easier overall. So just make sure that you are aware of those requirements into CFR 200.
So Aaron, someone just popped in a follow-up to that, and they were asking about, I think a lot of people are tracking additional healthcare information during that time. Like, is your understanding, Aaron and Taylor, like because of COVID-19, there is additional allowability for that healthcare information to be tracked?
So in terms of, okay, it sounds a bit broad, but what I would say is this: any cost that is not explicitly in the regulation, if it does not explicitly state you cannot incur this cost, then run it through that test that I mentioned a minute ago, and if it then meets the requirements of that 3-part test, then that would be sufficient. As I mentioned before, we're gonna do what we can to work with you and provide the flexibility we can. But anything that is not permissible per regulatory requirements, that has not received a waiver, is still in effect. Any other regulation that hasn't been waived is still in effect.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So I think we have a request for just an audible yes to this. So in the HQS waiver for re-inspection, so those who are currently a current participant, they do not have to inspect their unit for this year. That's correct, right?
For re-inspections?
Yeah, for re-inspection.
For re-inspections, you do have that waiver. I can't recall off the top of my head what the length is, but I think it is 1 year.
Okay. Great, thanks. So there's your audible yes. You don't have to re-inspect for this time. So quick, someone asked, like, is the target population for the rapid rehousing initiative those that are coming out of quarantine and isolation only? So for the expedited housing initiative, the answer is no. I mean, we're looking at folks who are affected by COVID-19. Some of those will be identified by the health department. Some of them may come out of like an isolation program like a Safe Haven is having. So we're still trying to nail down the exact population, but it's just general, real broadly, homeless folks who are affected by COVID-19, primarily coming out of the shelter or street outreach system. So we will release who those exact people are. And really, just to be clear, like, we're expediting people into permanent housing, and we see rapid rehousing for some as a form of a bridge to get them to their next intervention, which could be PSH, it could be a CHA voucher, and some people will just be involved in rapid rehousing like always. I think we have a couple more. Someone asked, would the emergency record keeping template provided be sufficient to use in client files documenting use of the HUD waiver? Yes, like we developed that actually in partnership with the local HUD, with Aaron and Taylor, and so we feel that is sufficient, a great template to use when documenting things for under the HUD waiver. So just to recall, like the HQS I think is confusing because there's just 2 parts to it. So someone asked, just to follow up, but we do need to conduct some sort of virtual inspection. That's how they read the regs. I don't know if someone's who's our HQS expert, but my recollection is there was 2. If it's a new inspection, they want you to do a virtual inspection of that new unit. But if it's a reinspection of someone, your annual reinspection of someone who's already in your project, that can be waived for a period of time. I do believe it's up to a year, but my memory is failing. But if someone else on of Liz, Elizabeth, Jennifer, Aaron, or Taylor has greater detailed memory, that would be helpful.
The
So
reinspection.
for initial inspections, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
For initial inspections, you do have to still review the unit. We're using the term virtual very broadly. Essentially, the way it's listed in the waiver, it's such as video streaming, but we also recognize that that's not necessarily possible in certain circumstances. So we'll accept pictures, right? You'd have to take a number of pictures, but you could take pictures. You could take a recording. It could be a FaceTime. Any of those are options. The key is making sure that, there's sufficient enough for you to document any conditions in the unit, but also that they have some sort of date attached to them, right? If you have a VHS tape on record, we're probably not going to accept that, if it's from when the building was first built or what have you. So you can have a verbal acknowledgement in the recording. That would work. The old-fashioned way, as Norm mentioned on the call last Friday, is you used to put a newspaper up there so you could see what the date was. Obviously, not many people get hard copy newspapers anymore, but something along those lines would work. And in terms of the waiver period, the HQS is the initial inspection is for 6 months, and the reinspection is for 1 year. You are correct, Karen.
I was like multitasking with the chat. So we had another question about environmental reviews. I mean, just to clarify, so Aaron and Taylor, like because this kind of comes up whenever there's new grant years, most were exempted last year if you're scattered site housing, but like if you're doing something project-based, you may need to do one, but maybe we'll send out some guidance on environmental reviews after the call. I don't know if I'm looking for more insight, but we'll follow up on the environmental review people. We've noted who you are. So are there any other template waivers like the one we created for HQS? I'm assuming you mean the, they meant the record keeping template. I mean, this is the record keeping template that we created in conjunction with HUD. I mean, you take it and change it however you'd like. I don't know, Aaron or Taylor, if you know of other record keeping templates in the HUD universe.
I have not seen any others. It's my understanding that this one that was created here, which may or may not have also had some help from the fabulous Nora Lally, is actually what's being rolled out nationally. So, there may be other versions out there, but you could, you may also find that what we've got here is the one that you'll find everywhere.
Great. So we're like at 2:59. So I think unless someone like sneaks in a question like super quick, there was one. I mean, again, with the template, I would say like change it however you want. Like when we did a sample, I think I did a sample for HQS, but like that was just a sample. Like I think if you want to like put something in it and you want someone from All Chicago to review your template for item 2 or 3 or any of them, feel free to send it to us. We're happy to do that. Like just send us to CoC programs, and if you want someone else's look at it, that's great. We're happy to do that. So feel free. We'll address any of the other questions that are outstanding because some of you threw a few in at the end, but like, thank you again for attending. We know you all are very busy doing incredible work in the community, as always, but especially now under the current health crisis. So thank you for joining us. If you have other questions, please email CoC programs. I'd like to thank Taylor and Aaron again for taking time out of their day to be here to like directly answer your questions. This is a real privilege that not every CoC gets. So thank you for helping us out. And again, if you have other questions, just email CoC programs and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And some of you who we didn't answer will follow up with you directly. Thanks.